I'd like to begin this panel with a toast to the explorers we've lost over the years. There are people, some of us who have never met, who have affected so much of what we know in Denis and are now gone. And they're the people we've known since that time who are gone. So, to those explorers coming down, I thank you. May we meet again someday. So about 6 years ago in late 2010, Carl Palmer, how many of you know him? No? No raised hands? Okay. Anyway, Carl Palmer came to me with an idea. Basically, the history of what came before in Denis needs to be retold. Because what happened in Denis was recorded in mostly dialogue and chat logs and text formats, basically. Lots of pictures and stuff. But there's no real easy way to re-access that for the new people coming in again and again. So that's basically what we came up with. That idea was called Heritage Night in URU, and for a good few years, I and a few others were doing what we're basically going to do here at Mysterium, which is retelling what came before for everyone else. This is all going to be abridged because I got to fit like 8 whole different sections into 1 hour. So if you're interested in reading the whole unabridged book that we put together, INEA's All Things URU site has that. It's under the Heritage Documents Journal title. You can check that out there. By and large, I'm sure we all know the basics of what came before our time in Denis, that Earth was an age ridden by a man for his people to flee from their dying world. And that cavern, that age, Earth, the cavern beneath the desert, that cavern was called Denis. Denis itself is a word that means new hope and new life and new, basically. It's all part of a cycle. For thousands of years, Denis lived beneath the cavern. People lived and flourished, and then, as we all know, man got the best of him, get to doing all sorts of nasty and evil things, including poison gases and earthquakes and bombs, and Denis fell. But people survived. That's how the cycle goes, living and dying, living and breathing, in and out. There was a woman who survived, Tiana, who had a son, Yen, who had another son, Atris, who had a daughter, Yisha. We all know who Yisha is. Yisha described what happened to Denis as the result of pride. It became a cancer until Denis could live no more. Living and dying, like I said, it's a cycle. And when we came to Denis, all of us who've heard this call for some reason or another, it's that same cycle. We come to Denis with some reason we don't quite understand, and yet here we all are at Mysterium. Around the turn of the century, the Denis Restoration Foundation came to Denis. Its leader, Elias Zandi, died before the cavern could be fully restored. His son, Jeff, we all know who he is. He now owns the land above the cavern, that volcano, the cleft where life flourished in the desert, where life still breathes beneath it. I wonder, how many of us has he seen go through that whole journey, that desert with those 7 cloths, finding everything? And well, that's for another story, I suppose. The foundation did die with its leader, but it was reborn into a council headed by Dr. Richard Watson. It consisted of 4 other members: Okuro Kadama, a man of very few words; Marie Sutherland, the group's people person; Victor Laxman, the tech specialist; and Michael Enberg, the lead restoration engineer. In 2002, this DRC opened the door to the authorized explorers, and Dr. Watson gave this speech that I'll be quoting here. Fellow citizens of Denis, I realize that salutation may sound a bit presumptuous, but this epic moment allows for some extravagance and anticipation on my part. For we all find ourselves at one of those rare junctures in human history. We stand on the edge of a precipice of discovery and enlightenment, and now we take the first step off the edge. Welcome to Denis. For the first time, I can say those words. Up until now, visitors have been limited to those of us who are academically adept enough to contribute, or those who are connected enough to be invited, but soon that will change. Soon, anyone who hears the call will be welcomed. Of course, at first their access will be limited and their numbers will be controlled, but the door is opening. Denis is beginning to wake from its long hibernation. What I'm trying to say is that your work here has been more than simply an archaeological exercise. We firmly believe that this place was meant to be inhabited. It was meant to be growing. It was meant to be alive. We are here because we've all felt that same feeling, that same calling. Even now, many more are beginning to feel that calling as well. They will come, and Denis will live once more. So I'm going to conclude this prologue of a prologue to a really, really long story with the same words that finish up Dr. Watson's speech. To Denis. You'd think with an opening like that things would go really smoothly, happily. People are people, and the cycle of life and death continues on. The initial restoration effort was privately funded by the remains of the Zandi Trust, but sometime in early 2003 it became externally funded by an outside source, a game company called Ubisoft. In the eyes of many today, that was the start of what we now call the prologue era, as no non-disclosure agreements were forced on explorers to keep them silent. Why would a company like Ubisoft come to fund the restoration? I would wager a guess it was for technology like the Kai, which we all know, a flat watch-shaped device, which has about as vast computational powers as modern-day cell phones, which we've only recently started getting down that small. The Denis had it for millennia more than us. As the restoration progressed, a hunter by the name of Douglas Sharper he was brought in to restore the age of Teledan, and through a journal that some of us had found access to, he rose to notoriety. He was a man who spoke out against the DRC's practices of secrecy, and a friend of his, well, they weren't friends at first, but a friend of his later on, Phil Henderson, who worked in the DRC as a restoration engineer, he would also become a person that many recognized by name, although for very different reasons. It's often said that there are two sides to everything. Yisha versus the DRC became one of the most hot-button topics of the time. The DRC were not happy with the influx of explorers from the surface, completely unauthorized by them, but being allowed down by Jeff Zandi. These new explorers had Relto books, and were using strange stones to link about. Relto pages, even, were confiscated from the ages as they appeared, but they would just reappear again, time and time again. Phil and Sharper ended up in the middle of it all back then, 2003. That's some year that year. Sharper was, after a while, he became very pro-Yisha. At one point, he said, "The books have more power than the DRC even know." And that was after some time of just speaking out against the DRC in general. But despite Sharper's antagonism of the DRC, early on he was given another project to restore besides Teledan. It was a pub somewhere in the Jatari, correct me if I'm pronouncing that wrong, the Jatari district. The place was called the Great Tree Pub at the time. Sharper's whole side of things and the people who followed him at the time banded together under that name, that symbol, the Great Tree. Today, that pub goes by a completely different name, Watcher's Sanctuary. But the way Sharper had it with the walls and the paint, well, you'll really only see that in pictures or 3D recreations. The reason for that is because Sharper would lose control over it, but I'll get to that in a bit. For now, we'll get back to Phil. Oh, Phil. Phil was just Phil, even in the early days of the restoration. He had numerous amounts of disappearing acts. Yeah. Especially through that borrowed Dornetter chemo. So that was really one of the the places to be at the time was Ed or Chemo, because everyone was hoping to catch a glimpse of Phil, maybe get him out of there. I don't know. Phil would eventually get let loose in the city, and he would be continually elusive, vanishing and reappearing again and again like the wind. Some of Phil's more insightful public encounters had him saying things like, "Watch the stone and wait." And that we were all on a journey, and that where we ended up was very much a part of that journey. But different people, different paths, different journeys, different branches, all a part of the same tree, the same cycle. We hadn't yet realized that we were all meant to be working together, just in different ways. Near the end of the year 2003, after a staggering growing number of incidents between the DRC, Sharper, Yisha's followers, and even Phil himself, somehow Phil managed to climb up on top of the guild hall in Agira. Twice. I know a few of you probably remember that. Sharp, he was talked down the first time, but he was taken in by the DRC to gauge his mental stability, I think. The DRC took his Relto book, and Sharper, he saw all of this as a kidnapping. In protest, he unlocked the egg room doors in his neighborhood, revealing that inside those private chambers, no Kai signal could get in or out. It was essentially just a private room that you could talk in, completely unmonitorable. The DRC didn't like that he'd revealed this before they could figure out what it was that was doing it, so they took away the Great Tree Pub from him. But Phil in Corral, the DRC's neighborhood, an explorer managed to go in and talk with Phil in those neighborhood private rooms, the egg room, whatever we call it these days. And they had an unmonitored conversation there, which let explorers know that Phil wasn't being treated horrendously in any way, which was good. And I think that led to Phil being released for the second time. But Sharper, somehow he got his hands on Phil's Relto book, and when Phil was released, he didn't get that Relto book back, and thus he was up on top of that guild hall for a second time, even higher this time. And people begged and pleaded once again. People wanted to go up there, drag Phil down bodily, but even the DRC had no safe way of getting up there. There was a crack, rumble, and the whole thing collapsed down. All they found afterwards was a crushed Kai, and everyone assumed he was dead. After that, Dr. Watson decided to go on a walkabout, and he disappeared for a while. And soon after that, February 4th, 2004, Ubisoft pulled their funding. And that was the end of the first restoration. We weren't idle in that time, though. Explorers were down there in Denis, exploring, seeing what they could do. Some managed to briefly jumpstart the Great Zero again and again, but it wasn't enough. During that time, lots of journeys were had, some very similar, some completely unique. One person who had a journey told Cyan about that. They made a game, Mist 5. At the time, we thought it was just a fun game, one of their last, but we had no idea of that the story was really telling us, what it had implied for our future. And then one day in 2006, there was a spark of life once again. The DRC came down, starting their own sort of unauthorized restoration of sorts. They decided, if the explorers can be down here for years with nothing new, we can do this on our own without funding. We can restore ages. We can just be there with them. And so they started doing that. They came down for a while. And eventually they earned the eye of two funding sources. The rather wealthy lady named Kate Alexander and a game company, GameTap. Another game company. GameTap we liked GameTap. They were nice people. Kate was a little, what's the word? I don't know. She was bossy, I think, is the word I'm looking for. So the DRC were working around the clock, announcing a new age through pictures and stuff. Eder Dillon, the first new age we would be getting out of this project. And then the DRC were doing town hall meetings, too. They were being public and talking with people, and December 19th, 2006. I'm sure some of you know what that date represents. But for those of you who don't, the DRC were holding a town hall meeting, and then during the middle of it, everyone heard this same sound across the cavern in the ages, this loud, echoing cry, this scream. It was a borrow. And when we heard it, that's when everything changed. People were linked out of the cavern, their ages, thrown to Relto, and somehow people who had never even been to Denis or weren't even wearing their Relto books at the time, people heard this scream and they were whisked away to Relto, their Relto. Suddenly people had books that they never had before and they were basically thrown in the deep end. Everything was broken because of the scream. Imagers, there were vast structural damage to the city itself, which forced the DRC to have to retread a lot of steps of the first restoration again, which did not make people happy. That goes without saying, really. But in the end, Eder Dillon and his twin age, Eder Sogel, were released, and after that, well, we soon realized there was a puzzle there that was very interesting. That it didn't work half the time. In fact, the first time that we solved the puzzle in Eder Dillon in my neighborhood, group session, the door got stuck and jammed open for days at end. People managed to sneak through and get their mysterious floating donut wedge without much trouble. Oh, but we did not really understand what the puzzle really meant, that we were supposed to be working together. Well, the puzzle was another thing we weren't really focusing on entirely for reasons. Alone or together, we were having this dream at the time. This prophecy was being whispered to us. Alone or together, again and again. These words haunted us. And people thought many, many things. Make a home, find a way. It was a very trying time for us back then. Very, very trying. The four pods of the Great Pod Age, Negalon, Dorino, Paephrin, and Tetsnot, released in that order. Much to great disappointment, because, well, as many people know, there are not very many animals in those pods. I mean, Dorino is the most populated, all those fish under the water. Guess whatever, at the time we guessed that whatever was killing off the animals, keeping them hidden, wasn't affecting underwater animals. But we obviously knew something was up, and the DRC knew it too, because just days before the release, there were tons of animals. But then suddenly, as the ages came out, the population just suddenly dwindled and dwindled. So Douglas Sharper, with his hunting expertise, was brought in. Nick White, who at the time was basically just a DRC Denis translator, whose only real claim to fame was that he was flirting with the leader of this anti-DRC movement and sharing trade secrets with the explorer population through them. Nick, Sharper, and an explorer named Rills, who was a zoological expert, went into Negalon to see what was going on with this. People were jealous. I don't think I need to tell you that we were vastly, vastly mistaken in being jealous of this, because they returned hours later, and it turned out that there was a predator freshly released into the age. It was killing things for sport, not even for food. It was just killing indiscriminately. People were wondering, was it a plague? No, it's just a predator, a very, very dangerous predator. Oh. And so we come to what we call Scars Week. I don't think I need to tell you that it was a week full of scars, both physical and emotional. Even the age released at the close of this week, Mankata, is a Dunny word that means heavily scarred. Enberg's daughter, Willow, or Wheelie as she was known to the explorer population, and her friend Rosette were running marker missions. Willow had come into the city time and time again since the DRC had come back down for the second restoration, but Rosette, this was her first time down. Willow was showing her around like any good friend does. The first scar of this week happened by nature of a minor earthquake in Agira. It was really minor, nothing really to be worried about, but it caused this crack to appear in a wall in the Callow pub down in the city. And Enberg warned explorers of the danger it might present, that the building might be unstable and could collapse on us if we were down there. Some people were thrill seekers, went down and saw it anyways. But here's the thing about people. If there's a danger to something, and you're in a position to do something about it, to keep people who are younger than you, smaller than you, out of that danger, people are going to go, and they're going to try and keep those people out of that danger. Since Wheelie and Rose were running marker missions in the city, a group of explorers decided, hey, let's just keep the Callow pub off limits so they don't go in there. There are plenty of other markers everywhere else. That way, if the building collapses, they won't be in there. And this had a side effect of keeping other people from going in. The DRC put up a few barricades too. But, Wheelie was clever. Very, very clever. She wanted to see the scar. She thought her dad and everyone else were overreacting. So while she and Willow and Rosette were at the library, Wheelie came up with this story that there was a new scar that had appeared in Agira. Needless to say, the human tendency to go to the new shiny thing took over, and lots of people abandoned their post at the Callow pub, and they ran to the library. I know I certainly thought there was something suspicious about it, though. Something just nagged at me, and I know that there were other people who felt the same way, that there was something off about this, that there was a new crack, even though there hadn't been any other signs of it before then. Personally, I realized almost immediately, the pub was unguarded. The pub was unguarded. That meant that anyone could get in there, including Wheelie and Rose. I tried to go in there and block it off myself, but the Nexus locked me out, and I never got in. Too many people were rushing to the city, either on the same hunch I had or just to see the new scar. But there wasn't a scar. Wheelie made it up. And by the time the DRC came down to investigate, Wheelie and Rose had disappeared off the Chi list, presumably gone offline to go up to the surface for lunch or something. But some of us were worried that they might have gone into this new scar that had appeared in the library, even though it wasn't real. It's hard to talk about this because I'm sure those of you who know what happened. We found out soon enough when the DRC finally reactivated their ties, Wheelie and Rose were under the Callow pub somehow. They'd fallen through this crack into a cave, and we'd only find out from Wheelie once she woke up and regained consciousness, but the cave was a borrow cave. It had a bunch of borrowglyphs everywhere. And when one of them had touched something on the wall, a borrow had appeared out of thin air, and it reached out towards them as everything shook around them, and Rosette ended up crushed by the rubble. Wheelie couldn't do much else. Her Ultrabook was damaged, either by the borrow or whatever. We'd learn out later it was just an anti-link field like we'd seen plenty of times before. Either way, Wheelie was stuck under that cave for days. The DRC dug through the rubble, and Nick ended up coming back from Negalon days early because he'd seen a symbol carved into a tree It was a zigzaggy line with circles surrounding it. And that same symbol was there in Agira, on the final floor above the cave where Wheelie was trapped. As the DRC started digging through that final floor, there was a burrow in the cave. We knew there was one in there from Wheelie's... The burrow in the cave, the one that was in there in those last moments, it started chanting, "Know something," over and over again. Wheelie was telling us this, even though she was getting really, really panicked, and we figured it out moments too late. Nolobin, the age that we were considering the burrow homeworld that we'd learned about through Mist 5. The burrow ended up killing Wheelie. And in the aftermath, we got Minkata. Age of solitude and desert and scars. And we'd forgotten about Nick. Nick could come back. So we'd all forgotten about Sharper. Sharper ended up coming back on those last days, and he said the predator in the Pod Age were burrow. Hundreds of them, but not just all in one group. There were two sides fighting each other, and he'd barely survived because two burrow had fallen on him and saved him and linked him to his Relto. Let's see, I kind of got ahead of myself on my script here, so I forgot to keep scrolling. Let's see. Okay, where do we go? Okay. So, a month passed, and we came to the week called A New Light, for multiple reasons. First one of which was the Great Zero being finally activated. We thought maybe this would be a hopeful sign that things would be brighter from now on, but some explorers were annoyed that the progress monitor on the Great Zero hadn't showed any of our progress affecting it. The monitor had just been broken, but people thought the DRC were just getting us to do random busy work while they did other stuff, and then flick a magic switch and on it comes. They were bitter. Very, very bitter. This was also the week that the Callow Memorial Imager was put in place, which, if you've been to the Callow pub since, it's percentile, big old mechanical thing with a bunch of metal screens on it that have names running across it. Names have been added to it since it was put in, sadly. Michael Emberg, at some point during all this, he disappeared, citing that he was going to find Watson, although that was all we could really guess that was what he was doing, because we had no real idea where he was going. He went off the grid, and who could blame him? His daughter had died. Irkana and the Watchers Pub were released this week as well. And in Irkana, as we all know, there's the devices for creating pellets, baked red algae feeding things that were supposed to make the lake algae in the lake grow again, glow brightly, and boom, be bright and everywhere. And the people who were bitter about the Great Zero thought that the DRC would just release one big super pellet and that would be it. I'm not kidding. People actually said that. They, like, literally, when I expressed interest in doing pellet runs, someone really said, oh, the DRC are just gonna drop a big old super pellet in the lake and it'll glow every day. They disillusioned a lot of people, and that set back the lake project for months, maybe even years. There wasn't much that happened this week, other than Kate taking up Edinburgh's voting position. Not a lot of people were happy about that, because now Kate had 2 votes to deal with, and rather than just 1, which meant she was now able to out and vote people if she wanted to. Sharper announced that he was going to Nolobin to hunt a Barrow, specifically the one that had killed Wheelie. We were not happy with him. We told him, don't go, don't go, don't do this. He didn't listen. He went anyways, and a month later, well, that was the week we ended up calling... Dang it, where did I put that? Okay. Familiar Voices. Well, the reason we called it Familiar Voices is because so many people came back. Well, Sharper, for one, he came back from his trip, and he said he'd killed a Borrow. Somehow we just knew he'd killed the wrong one before we even saw the body, and see it we did. Borrow linked into Watchers with it, and paraded it around, and somehow we got on the idea that the two sides were divided by eye color, red and blue eyes. And someone saw the Borrow on the imager with blue eyes, and they said, you killed a good one. We had no idea how we knew it was a good one, but we just knew it was a good one that he'd killed. Oh, later in the week, when Phil Henderson actually reappeared, we learned from Sharper himself that a good Borrow had jumped in his line of sight. He'd lined up a shot on the Borrow he was sure had killed Wheelie, and that Borrow had saved us all from his mistake, Phil would say. Also released that week was The Age of Jalak. Of course, people are conflicted. It's either Jalak or Jalak Dador. I think the official name is Jalak, and Jalak Dador is a pun some restoration engineer came up with and put on a journal. There are a lot of arguments about that age. Mainly about whether or not we would get a donut wedge out of it. There was no puzzle, no donut wedge. It was just a Denis game age, like, well, you know Gemedet. It's a 3D sort of game. Now, the Denis love their 3D games, and as for what kind of game Jalak actually is meant to be, we have no idea. We came up with our own puzzles, and, well, people made artwork there. Carl would say that Jalak needed more love, because it pretty much got forgotten after that week. Borrow had appeared everywhere in that week. Just everywhere. Everywhere, in the cities, in the ages, and some people who were still bitter about it was like, oh, this is a hoax. There's no way. People just made Borrow costumes or something like that, and they wouldn't believe it until they saw it with their eyes. We also got Corel, the DRC neighborhood, officially accessed because the DRC were seeking to make the 5 official guilds official. You know, well, they were seeking to activate 5 guilds. And they'd chosen, well, the Explorer made Guild of Greeters, but the other 4 were messengers, maintainers, writers, and cartographers. And so in Corel, they had 5 different tables set up with shirts of various colors, and people went to Corel to look at everything. Guess what happened? Borrow. I was there for that one. Oh, that was chaos. Just pure chaos. The Borrow just was... At the time, I knew what it was doing. It was playing tag with us. It was appearing somewhere. We'd all rush to that spot, and then it disappears somewhere else. And we were running all over that neighborhood. And at one point, I got shoved into a wall. I almost would have hit my nose if it hadn't been for the Borrow being there. Literally, I ran into a Borrow, and for a few seconds, we just stared eye to eye. And then I backed away as quickly as possible because I was afraid it was going to be mad for my running into it. It didn't. Instead, it just kept teleporting around until we finally got organized and had a sit-in around the clock plaza. Of course, there's no actual clock in Corel, but the clock plaza, you know what I'm talking about. So the Borrow showed up. It sat around with us for a little bit. It seemed approving, and then it disappeared for good. It was only when I was writing out my script for this that I realized that's what it wanted. It didn't want us running all over creation trying to chase it down. It wanted us to sit, gather, and be united. It took me years to figure that out, and well, We really had no idea. Okay, let's see now. We should be... yes. The week called Deception for what we learned during it. Phil showed up. First and foremost, bright and sunny, and... oh, how he rambled about the colors. He likes the colors. Look at all the colors, man. Look at all the colors. Did you see that cone? That's an obscure reference to a video that some of you probably haven't seen. Someone gets it. So, Phil showed up ranting about a he who we'd heard about in that dreams prophecy. He will come, they will come, and I will come as well. We had no idea who the he was referencing to. We were pretty sure the they were the borrow, and the I will come as well, being spoken in our dreams by Isha. Obviously it meant Isha, so who was the he? Some of us remembered back when Phil had been climbing up on the Guildhall, he'd also mentioned a vague he, who some of us at the time thought meant the great king buried far beneath it, along with some descriptive book that led to a plague age. But nobody was sure what Phil meant. Not until Sharper showed up and said, I know who the he is, and you should listen to him when he shows up, and I'm not gonna tell you who he is. Because I'm being coy like that. Because I'm Sharper and I can do whatever I want. Because I got the fancy one-side folded hat. He didn't actually say all that, but you could tell he had the thoughts in his head. He also, Sharper released his old spy room on which he spied on the DRC from. And in that spy room was Phil's old Relto book. Of course, Phil had a new one, so what use did he have for the old one? That poor Relto is so sad that Phil abandoned it. Just, it cries so much. Have you seen it? It just cries. Poor Relto. Anyway, Michael Enberg returned next, but he wasn't the he. But we had an inkling of who it would be after he showed up in the city and said, no, I'm not Phil's he, but I brought him here. So, we knew, we had an inkling, because Enberg had gone off after Watson. We were sure it was going to be Watson. And it was. Oh, he showed up, went through the city recollecting his Nexus links, and he explained a couple of things, but announced he was going to do a speech later on. I'm not going to quote that. I don't have the time for the whole thing. But he did tell us during his speech that the Borrow had created a vast illusion, a grand deception, in quotes, that all was well in Denis. And that was the reason that the good side of the Borrow, despite being greater in numbers, were losing. Because they were sacrificing themselves to keep us from knowing what was going on. And I know I felt kind of guilty hearing that. We were here in Denis for our own purposes, and here the Borrow were sacrificing themselves. Watson also told us that he was the one who took the journey that was that the game Myst 5 was based on, and he was the one who had freed the Borrow by giving them their tablet. Yeah. Thanks, Watson. It was the right thing to do, but with freedom comes choice. Oh. That week ended on that note, basically. November 1st, 2007, the start of the week called Exodus. 11 a.m. in Agira. Kate Alexander, who had said that she would believe a Borrow war when she saw it, announced her resignation. Oh, she said she wasn't getting a return back on her investment, but you just knew she was scared. She was running scared, and she was getting out of Dodge before all hell broke loose. She was leaving, but GameTap stayed behind, so we still had some funding, but the DRC was sure it wasn't going to be enough because Kate was the major source of investment. And the DRC were as much as a loss by this sudden announcement as we were. They had no idea it was coming. It completely blindsided them just as much as us, and they just pressed on with that week's release as planned, the Great Zero, Stained Glass Projects, and the Age of Annone. Oh, they had no idea what to do. Marie was certain it was the end of the First Restoration all over again. We went through Annone quickly because a few of us had found our way to Annone before. I don't need to tell you how we all did that. It was a little different, but we figured it out soon enough, and voila! We found Kavir, home again, prison to Atris, last known resting place of the Borrow tablet. Because of that fact alone, we were certain the Borrow would never come to Kavir. Ugh, it was foolish of us. Because guess what happened? Borrows started appearing in the city, swarming in mass, going every which way, and the biggest cluster of them just swarmed the arch endlessly. Personally, I saw something on top of that arch moving. It's not widely confirmed by a lot of people, but I saw something moving up there. A few people saw it too, but personally, I think it was the leader of the enemy side of the Borrow, the one who had been tortured and lost his shoulder skin, the ability to link at all. And Borrow did show up in Kavir along with Isha. The mistbook was put there at some point, and it was just the library, but that's not the important part. The important part is that Yisha showed up, and she gave a speech, which I'm going to quote here to end, to basically the last big thing I'm going to quote. So, I will have words. Destruction is almost upon us. They are here, fighting in war. Freed from their prison, the Borrow choose their way now. Good and evil stand before them. No longer are they slaves to the tablet. No longer is their destiny locked to the wishes of others. No longer is their freedom captive. They are powerful, and with freedom, some are dangerous. Most of the Borrow are friends. They stand with us, protecting us from the evil that surrounds you almost constantly. They sacrifice for you. They battle and die for this cavern. They battle and die for the ages and for your comfort. They fight for the demise as well. They watch over us all. But there are those who have chosen not to side with you, with the demise, or with good. They seek revenge for the evil done to them. Revenge is their excuse, but freedom is their cause. They are able to make the choice, and they bask in such opportunity to do as they please. With freedom comes choice, and with choice comes evil as well as good. Their leader can be seen clearly. He is missing a large patch of skin on his shoulder, taken from him in the torturous lab of Escher. Because of that, I will draw them away. Away from the cavern, away from you. I do not know how long they will seek what I carry. It could only be days. It could be months. Destruction is coming. It is almost here. I will delay it as long as I can, but in the meantime, you must find a way. You must make a home. Destruction will be here soon. I will try to return and help you in the future. If things go well, I will offer you my aid. If things do not, you must find a way on your own. Regardless, you must be ready. Destruction will come sooner or later. When it does, you must have a way. You must make a home. I will do all that I can in the meantime. I must leave now. Goodbye. And so Yisha left, taking the war with her in an instant. That night, the DRC, too, left to find a new major funding source, and the next day, Sharper left as well, seeing no need to stick around. We were alone. We had game taps still, but in a few months' time, GameTap's own parent company began to sell them out, and so GameTap and the Cavern ended their relationship on a better note than we'd ended ours with Ubisoft. We really don't blame Ubisoft. I mean, we blame Ubisoft, but we don't blame GameTap, because how can you blame the company for getting sold out by their own parent company? That's just cruel. Kate, oh, she had no reason to leave. No real reason, anyways. So, over the next few months, we finally left the cavern, slowly, surely, but we left. A few of us stayed behind to keep an eye on things, make sure things were running smoothly still, like the Great Zero, or just to still run pellet runs, keep the lake running. But without clear funding and the prospect of the Barrow losing their war because of us, most of us decided to stay away. And so it stayed until that fateful day, February 4th, once again, 2010. It was ironic, that date. I mean, the first restoration had ended on that date, and now here was something happening on it again. But this time good instead of bad. Almost like a balance of the cosmic scales of karma. And Laxman posted on the DRC forums about it. A sensor had been tripped. And obviously, the sensors in the more well-traveled areas weren't of concern because explorers were still traversing them, so that something had been tripped in a specific area. That implied that there was something that had happened. And so, Marie and Kodama went down to the Denis to investigate. They ran into a few explorers. Everyone talked it through, and well, there's another journal on Ainea's All Things URU site, written by Mac. He tells this story a whole lot better because he was there. I was off doing other things on the surface at the time. I was keeping an eye on things, but I had no idea what was going on until we were all let back in. And so the cavern continues to live for now, living in its semi-awake state, and someday everything will come crashing back down on us again, sent forward from that November day in 2007, and whatever Yisha has against that twisted faction will either expire in its usefulness or be taken by the opposing side, so... But until then, Denis lives and breathes, and... So, to Yisha and all those who are out there postponing the inevitable, I wish you good luck. I'd ask if we have questions, but I wrote this script assuming I'd end up with in excess of 15 minutes. So, if you guys have any questions for me, come find me afterwards. I'm just gonna pack up here, and thanks for listening to me talk for 45 minutes.